Anastasia. That was well said about always being in good shape. But what's interesting is that people usually associate the phrase to always be in shape with sports, or rather with athlete training before competitions. For example, I remember that when we were just beginning to practice this meditation in our group, guys started comparing it to sports. They said that any coach is well aware of the fact that by artificially creating conditions for his mentee that are as close to reality as possible, he thus increases his chances of winning the next competition. A good athlete also knows that despite all the difficulties of training, despite all the bruises and scratches, thanks to overcoming these obstacles, he gains experience and skills. In time, the athlete gets used to the increased daily demands towards himself. It is only from the outside that overcoming such different educational obstacles may appear as something complex and even unnecessary for the main competition. The sportsman himself is completely absorbed in the work on improving his skills. He is well aware that self-pity in training and attempts to wriggle out of the workload will definitely lead to defeat in the competition. The guys came to the conclusion that this is probably just like in this meditation for the activation of the back and lateral essences and then tracking them in everyday life when a person artificially creates all sorts of obstacles for himself and learns to overcome them, with the possible exception of one difference. Here, unlike in sports, the person is his own coach, and so he sets for himself increased requirements for his vigilance. The success of such work on yourself, just like in sports, depends directly on how conscientiously the person treats it. The example is certainly clear for those who begin to practice this meditation, but what I've noticed is that in this case, people used set stereotypical patterns accepted as positive in society. Sport here is regarded as work on and victory over yourself, and is associatively compared to spiritual work. But if we look at the root of the meaning of these processes, they're far from being the same concepts. Rigden. Right. These are the substitutions which few people notice at the beginning of their sports career, but which are felt quite clearly at its end. It is considered in society that if a person goes in for sports, especially professional sports, this means that he wins, first of all, over himself, meaning overcoming negative qualities and laziness, learns discipline, and so on. This is even regarded as a condition for harmonious development of personality. And victories in the professional sport are generally presented as the summit of human labor in self-perfection. But few people notice what global substitutions are hidden in these concepts. What do the majority of people usually associate sports with? First of all, with a game where the main thing is to win by any means. Secondly, with stadiums where a great number of sports fans gather. This crowd focuses all its attention on the game, which triggers a great surge of emotions in it. Besides, mind you, this surge of emotions is quite expected and planned, regardless of the result of the game. Intelligent people should stop and think about this, about who actually does this and for what purpose. After all, human emotions are powerful energy. A person nourishes the animal nature with his negative emotions, while masses of people nourish the animal mind with them. And generally speaking, how did the professional sport appear? How did sports competitions emerge as mass entertainment? Quite often, people do not analyze even that information which they're presented in the media, not to mention an independent search for the cause of a phenomenon. The press often gives an example that the first Olympic competitions were organized as far back as the times of ancient Greece. But what was the reason for their origin? Few people know that such peaceful entertainment competitions were the consequence of constant wars. The better athletically prepared the warriors of a certain side were, the better was the outcome of wars for their organizers. And this incentive of the animal nature is still reflected in the realities of the sports today. Preparing for competitions and also the very goal of becoming a champion are in fact based on the constant stimulation in an athlete of megalomania, egoism, and the spirit of competition. After all, the more ambitions an athlete has, the more he will practice. And this is not a matter of winning over yourself, as it is advertised everywhere. Actually, all of the personality's attention is focused on the development of skills to control its body at the necessary moment, including the use of the body's reserves and phenomenal abilities. This is just a small victory over flesh within the framework of the dominant thinking from animal nature. And for what does an athlete sacrifice himself, the time of his life and his health? For the sake of his personal glory, and at the same time for the glorification of the country, which provides him with various benefits and privileges in exchange for victory. But what lies behind the organization of such competitions and emotional participation in them of millions of people? What do they stimulate in people? Few people stop and think about it. And what is the end result of that same champion's career? Does he really conquer himself? No. His result is former glory, a wounded sense of pride that he has been left underappreciated by his country, and inner emptiness. For as soon as he starts having health problems or stops winning competitions, nobody needs him, which is a common occurrence in professional sport. It is inner emptiness that triggers all these negative surges. Because to win over yourself means to overcome the animal nature in yourself. This is where the attainment of spiritual harmony lies, and not in mastering to perfection some skills of controlling your physical body. Engaging in sports is wonderful, but only for the purpose of keeping your body in a healthy state, so as not to have major problems from the animal nature. However, it is much more important for a person to concentrate on his spiritual component. That is the point. Anastasia. You're right. This is a problem of society, but it begins with each person. Even regarding this meditation, when a person is focused on serious daily work on himself, on his own spiritual development, in general, if he learns to be on a qualitatively different wave of perception, then his essences will begin to work differently. They will simply be switching more often to a new mode of operation of this dominant perception, manifesting, in fact, their other qualities and abilities, including the so-called phenomenal abilities of man. As they wrote in ancient Indian treatises, act but renounce the fruits of your labor, that is, act unselfishly and not out of self-love. This meditation, in my view, contains a very important aspect of understanding the nature of man and his complex structure. The meditation makes it possible to understand from personal experience the mysterious process of emergence of emotional surges and human thoughts. After all, chemical and physical processes in the brain are already a consequence of the primary azoosmos, that is, of the initial impetus of energy. I remember you making an excellent associative comparison of the function of between brain with a kind of receiver which converts energy fluctuations, signals coming from the essences, into the subtle matter of feelings and emotions. Rigdon. If the associations related to technology are more appropriate for comprehending this process, then I can surely give such examples as well. For ease of understanding, the function of the ancient structures of the brain, may be figuratively compared to a television set. By the way, the word television is derived from the Greek word tele, meaning far, and the Latin word visor, which stands for observer, and viso, meaning I look, vision. Or rather, it may be compared to a cathode ray tube, kinescope, in the TV set, which converts the electric and light signals that are invisible to the human eye into visible images in the frequency range perceived by us. In the between brain, just like in the main blocks of the analog kinescope TV set, there is, figuratively speaking, its own signal receiver. By its functions, it is conditionally similar to another device on the TV set, the channel selector, which not only amplifies, but also singles out the signal of the corresponding necessary channel and then converts it to a standard intermediate frequency. Besides, there are, associatively speaking, a certain signal decoding unit, a sound and video signal detector, an intermediate frequency amplifier, an audio power amplifier, and a cathode ray tube. That is the same physics, but at the level of subtle energy processes which take place in the human microcosm and its complex structure. The between brain is one of converters of energies into coarse matter, and the essences may be compared to television towers that broadcast their programs on various channels with the help of their transmission antennas. Let us take, for instance, the left, the right, and the back essences. For them, a person's attention to their programs is, speaking in technical language, a power supply unit, voltage amplifier of vertical and horizontal deflection, an amplifier of image channels in the form of illusions imposed upon the person, and the remote control unit of managing the person and his mood. So either a thriller about his own pride appears in the person's head, or a horror movie made of his own fears, or a melodrama titled The Wailing Wall about the lost past. That is, these essences will very skillfully draw any plausible illusion, make a mountain out of a molehill, and force the person to deeply experience various negative emotions while using that which is so valuable for his spiritual development, his attention. However, if the person switches to perceiving the television broadcasting of his front essence, he will be able to see and feel an entirely different perception of the world, one that is useful for his spiritual growth. For example, a documentary about real life and about the inner spiritual world, which is reflected in the outer. Thanks to such contact and empathy, the personality receives a powerful positive charge, which allows it to concentrate all its attention in the spiritual direction. The truth is that after such a film, the regular human life will seem sheer acting. So it only depends on the person what he will give attention to in his head and which signals he will receive and amplify. Figuratively speaking, the person holds in his own hands not only the remote control of his TV set, but also the opportunity to control all the television towers along with their TV and radio companies. Moreover, thanks to this meditation technique, a person will be able to understand both himself and other people. When you are able to clearly identify in yourself the moments connected with activation of one or another essence, it will be easy for you to also feel a hidden influence upon you by other people. How? For example, you're talking to a person or listening to certain information on television or radio. At the moment of the conversation or receiving information from an external source, you simply focus on your neutral median position as an observer surrounded by your four essences. Or rather, you enter into the state of the observer that is detached from circumstances and trace in yourself which of your essences is activated by this information. After all, Besides verbal exchange of information between people, there is also an interaction of their essences. Thanks to such tracking of the influence of this information on you, you will understand what has been the original emotional foundation of it and for what actual hidden purpose it is being communicated to you. For example, if your interlocutor is lying or being deceitful, your left essence will definitely be activated. If he provokes aggression in you, the center of your right essence will start spinning. While if he awakens in you a surge of positive emotions, love and good, then your front essence activates. Thus, you can follow the real situation and not that illusion which is being constantly imposed upon you from the visible and the invisible worlds for the purpose of controlling your consciousness. Anastasia. Yes, if many people master this meditation technique, the need to lie and control each other will disappear in society. There will be no point in it, for everyone will know the truth about each other. Rigdon. That is so, but this will happen only if the majority of people in society want to change for the better. Then humanity will have a chance to follow an entirely different, qualitatively new way of civilized spiritual development. But what will modern mankind choose? That is the question. After all, this meditation technique had been given to people previously. Moreover, it was brought into the life of society at different times. I would not say it was given in such detail, but it was quite understandable for the thinking of people of those days. But people are people, and many of them unfortunately enjoy modernizing and complicating the pure knowledge and the simple truth. Nevertheless, echoes of this practice can still be found in the secret knowledge of different nations of the world. Only today it has been camouflaged to the point of absurdity into the rituals that are accompanied by singing, dancing, and fancy shows with tambourines and drums. And all this is done for the purpose of switching into an altered state of consciousness for a disciple or a priest, and listening to a talking spirit from the right or the left side, and so on. Although while doing this practice in its pure form, such complexities are not needed. This is all human and superficial. Here, at first stages, you simply learn to reconfigure the perception of consciousness and track and control your state, and later there are simply working moments. Generally speaking, I should note that since ancient times, such basic spiritual practices related to the fundamental knowledge and human spiritual growth have, as a rule, been recorded in certain signs and symbols. Anastasia. Signs and symbols are a special topic. If possible, it would be desirable to hear about them from you personally in more detail and to provide this valuable information to the readers. Since ancient times, the history of mankind has nearly always been surrounded by signs and symbols. But after extensively searching for information about them in the libraries of different cities and on the internet, I came to a disappointing conclusion that signs and symbols are present in every historical epoch, but the knowledge about them has either been lost or the deciphering of their meaning has been so grossly distorted that hardly any truth has remained. There is no primordial spiritual knowledge about signs which you have communicated. What is available to ordinary people nowadays? At best, there are dictionaries of symbols, books of dubious content given in the interpretation of Freemasons about the paraphernalia of occult teachings. Scientists dissociate themselves from such interpretations because they understand what lies at the root of such publications. At the same time, science has already accumulated very rich material about graphical symbols and signs specific to ancient archaeological cultures of various continents and times. Many of the magical ritual signs which were considered important in the spiritual culture of different nations are identical, but so far Scientists have been unable to decipher them fully. Now I understand why. Even what you told us in this respect gave me an entirely different understanding of the picture of the world and the knowledge about the human being. While reading works about graphical symbols of archaeological cultures, articles on ethnography, folklore, mythology, and cosmogony in the representation of different nations, I came to the conclusion that scientists are lacking exactly this link. That very key to deciphering science in order to connect, understand, and read this unique information, which is spiritual wealth of mankind. Rigdon. Yes, unfortunately, despite the abundance of ancient signs and symbols in modern society, much of the knowledge about them has really been lost by people. That is a fact. But this is not surprising. The problem is in people, in the society itself, starting with an individual and his dominant desires and ending with priorities of the human society. Just look at the history of mankind. Continuous wars, a constant struggle for religious and political power, and worst of all, withholding from the majority of people the true spiritual knowledge which leads to real freedom of the personality and liberation of the soul. Why was the primordial knowledge concealed from the majority? Why was it distorted beyond recognition and then also interpreted from one's own mind, mired in the materialistic thinking? Why has this information been eradicated from the consciousness of new generations and buried in oblivion for millennia? Simply because this primordial knowledge made it possible for people to develop themselves spiritually on their own, independent of those same politicians and priests who to this day call themselves intermediaries between people and gods. This knowledge made people free, independent of the structures of political and religious power. It allowed nations to unite independently. After all, it is very difficult to control spiritually free people, even more so to try to impose on them discord, fear, aggression, and other mindsets from the animal mind. Anastasia. I totally agree with you that the problem is indeed in people themselves and in the society they form, as well as in the prevalence of disunity and fragmentation in relationships between people. Even if we take details, for instance, while looking into scientific research regarding ancient signs, even a superficial study of the problems set forth in these works makes you wonder at the wall of artificial obstacles which have to be faced by those who try to get to the heart of the truth today. Under what conditions do scientists have to do their work, say in ethnology, ethnography, archaeology, and ancient history? Everything is done on sheer enthusiasm and for meager wages. At that, in their work, they're faced with numerous bureaucratic or financial obstacles, lack of organization and coordination in attracting specialists from related disciplines for a more in-depth, complex study of various matters. Or often, they simply face the conspiracy of silence, the so-called in the world scientific taboo on certain topics or findings. Not to mention the situation on the global scale, when in many cases obstacles are created artificially to prevent access to certain information or unique archaeological findings, which in fact are being hidden from people. Naturally, all this happens not without the involvement of certain interested parties. Such information is either not brought to the attention of a wider scientific community, being left in depositories to collect dust, or significant artifacts end up in private collections, or they're even completely removed by secret services and disappear into thin air. Probably, someone is very afraid that this information will shake the ideology and the foundation of somebody's power, which is profitable for controlling the contemporary nations. So all honor to those scientists who, in spite of all the obstacles, continue to work selflessly in this field of science and to inform nations about significant findings which destroy the illusion of savagery of the ancient peoples and which often testify to the priority of spiritual values and knowledge in those distant times. But with all this, still the question arises, why does the society itself remain silent? After all, it is first and foremost society that should be interested in its spiritual past in order to understand and correctly determine the vector of its future. Rigdon. It is silent because the consciousness of the majority of people has been so conditioned by the stereotypes of consumeristic material thinking that even the very formulation of this question is incomprehensible to an ordinary person. When his thinking is blinded by such attitudes and patterns, he simply does not understand why, as a matter of fact, these scientific professions should have a greater priority for society and the state than, for instance, the profession of nanotechnologist who deals with research at the atomic and molecular level, or of financial analyst or physicist dealing with new types of weapons. But the rub is that apart from addressing current scientific issues, all the researchers you mentioned above from those professions that are disrespected in many countries and which are related to studying antiquity and the culture of different peoples, made it a priority for themselves the super objective of nothing less than reconstructing all the sides of the spiritual life of society. And who among those in power will like this? After all, if the masses know for certain what the ordinary people just like themselves sought millennia ago, what world outlook and sacred spiritual knowledge they had, how they perfected themselves, and what they devoted their lives to, then the question will arise, where is modern mankind heading to? And why has this knowledge been concealed from the majority for millennia? After all, how is the human of today different from the human of the past? The difference is only in a slight change of external conditions of existence, but the internal problems, the struggle between the spiritual nature and the animal nature, have remained the same. Moreover, such large-scale scientific work on the reconstruction of the spiritual side of society's life implies decryption of the core sacred meanings and key symbolic motifs in different cultures and worldviews. And that means that it entails obtaining scientific evidence of the importance of the role that practically the same signs and symbols played for different peoples of the world. In different periods of social formations, regardless of geographic remoteness and isolated habitation of such nations on different continents. Signs and symbols have existed in the human society from the very beginning. They're still present now in the modern world, regardless of the fact that most people do not understand their meaning and the power of influence they exert. You yourself already know perfectly well, thanks to meditative experience, how some signs and symbols affect the physics of the visible and the invisible worlds. Signs and symbols are the keys to the spiritual treasury of the human society. This is a code to the complex processes which reveals secrets of controlling advanced physics as well as new horizons of scientific knowledge. Anastasia. Yes, knowing this, one is able to understand what powers each human being possesses by achieving certain levels of self-improvement. However, this imposes a great responsibility as well. Rigdon. Undoubtedly. But people remain people. Even having the knowledge about the power and the significance of signs and symbols, they distorted it with time, added something, and complicated it at their own discretion. As a result, what some people knew at the beginning of a millennium and others at its end was clearly different in meaning and qualitatively different in content. But from time to time, this knowledge was renewed in the human society. Some cultures had vanished, taking the sacred secrets to their grave, while others, on the contrary, had formed and blossomed out of the remains of previous generations' knowledge. So the presence of this knowledge in its primordial form has always been relevant for any peoples living in different parts of the globe, for it would not simply give a key to the knowledge of their ancestors, but also considerably expand their own cognition in the field of spiritual self-development. In the modern world, one can find entire systems of their own traditional symbols and signs with any nation. However, the primordial knowledge about them has been lost. Even the very names of symbols and signs are no longer connected in the semantic interpretation with the secret knowledge about the human being. They mostly represent a notion of a certain value in science and also have an everyday conditional meaning which characterizes one or another manifestation of the material world.